All right. So today we're going to kind of move on. We're going to talk just briefly review a little bit about taxes real quick, and then move on to some other details. Again, here's some just W-2 examples I put in there like last week, showing 100,000 in salaries, showing about 18,000 paid in mortgage interest, and believe me, that's really not that unreasonable if you're just buying a house, and you've got a whatever $2,000 a month kind of mortgage, so 24,000 per year. 18,000 is actually probably about right, based upon even escrow being withheld. So let's say you actually paid 20,000 in payments, and the other part in insurance and other holdbacks for property taxes, etc. So anyway, the numbers you can vary around. I actually here we're saying 3,000 in property tax, but that equates up to $21,000 worth of expenses. Now, if those, if you're a renter and there's zeros, you're going to owe about 5 grand nearly. So the withholding on this, I used a different number. Um, and let's look at the 1098. So again, let's fill in those blocks. So we're putting 12,000 in this case, 300,000. So the numbers are jumping around, but you get the picture. This number up here, the refund jumps to a positive. So, uh, I would encourage you to, if you aren't actually using it this year, to use one of these tax programs just to kind of calculate where you're going to be, even if you're having somebody else prepare it. Because, like I say, for most cases, you ought to try to at least run an example yourself, even if you don't have the confidence to prepare it for yourself. I think you should probably get there, and also, and that's not a slight, against you. It's a slight against some of the people I've seen preparing them who are maybe don't have your interest at heart. I mean, those people, if you're a person with a huge income paying a huge fee to them, yeah, they're going to take a personal interest. But if you're just, one of the uh, lesser income clients that they have, that it's tough. Okay, so anyway, what I'm showing on this one is a student loan. Remember, I had an income of 100 grand, and you're all excited because you're going to deduct that student loan interest that you paid, and guess what? Oh, your income 100,000. Income limit was 80 grand for that. So again, before you get excited about a deduction or this or that, or somebody's telling you, oh, don't worry about it. Somehow it's not going to cost you anything. It's tax deductible. Number one, we talked about deductions versus credits. Credits are a one-for-one reduction. Deductions are only at your tax rate. So in most cases, a fraction, whatever your ultimate bracket ends up being, let's just say 28%. You give them $1,000, you only get $280 worth of reduction on your taxes. But in some cases, and unfortunately, I found this out the hard way. I've thought I was qualifying for certain educational expenses, and then found out that because I'd hit the lofty goal of 80 grand, which is kind of middle class anymore, you don't even qualify. So keep that in mind. Um, Other donations, there were some changes made that I wanted to kind of highlight. That goes back to 218 data. So this is uh, just again going to show what happens here. So again, you get that incremental difference. See how it's roughly those numbers that I'm talking about. So it's again, it's going to, what makes this more confusing is it's not linear because we're using brackets. And if you remember brackets, you're not all your income is taxed at the same rate. It has to go from one bracket to another. So to do the math in your head is, well, impossible. But for a computer, it's not difficult at all. Purchase price. So, and various. I've been working with a tax person lately because stuff is even getting more complex, and she was an auditor for a number of years, and she's all about less is more in terms of information on all the business documents. They want you to say what line of business you're involved in, and every form she puts down any legal purpose. It's like, man, it's no business of theirs. I really don't want to poke the bear. I don't want to, you know, make these people angry, but apparently the numbers are just so vast that the IRS doesn't look that closely anyway. Um, and when I was talking about some of these casualties, theft deductions, you have to make sure, they actually list, named storms. And Alaska actually was declared after the earthquake. Certain items were regions were declared disaster areas. It makes a big difference. It's not just a news release. If it makes its way into the IRS code, it has tangible results. All right. Now we're going to talk a little about banking and interest rates. And what I'll try to stress, to kind of summarize here is you need to do more with your money than just put it in the bank. Just putting it at getting some savings account thing. There's a couple reasons for that. One is inflation is out there. Right now it's pretty low, and we'll look at some of the rates, but inflation is a constant. Now, again, the way inflation works, it doesn't reduce the amount of money you actually have, but it reduces the buying power of the money you have. So, if you put $100 in an account and you still have $100 or just slightly more at the end of the year, you aren't even. The buying power of that $100 is probably down around $97. Inflation, if you just want to use a planning factor, for your financial lifetime, is probably going to be 3% ish. Those numbers are going to vary, obviously, based upon economic circumstances. And you can get double-digit inflation, and you can have recessions where things actually go negative. But for planning, 3% is probably not a bad rule of thumb. So anyway, we'll jump through some of these financial planning institutions just so you have a familiarity with them. Things have changed a lot, though. There used to be, and now we're talking a long time ago, but the book still relates to all this. There used to be, savings and loans and credit unions and banks, and those institutions all still exist, but the ability of all of these institutions to kind of do the same thing is relatively new. Back in the day, if you wanted to get even a checking account from a credit union, that was not so much done, or they call it a share draft account, and it had more limitations, and there was limits on the number of checks per month, and they didn't want to do wire transfers and stuff like that. Now that's completely different. Where those guys do the same sort of services that a typical bank would. But anyway, so we're looking at commercial banks. This can be a big deal. FDIC insures up to 250,000 per depositor. In case there's a run on the bank. The way banks work is they get your money and they don't hold it. They keep a percentage, but most of it they loan back out. So if everybody goes to the bank on the same day and asks for their money back, that's called basically a run on the bank. And if that were to happen, the bank fails. The bank doesn't keep that money around. They don't have your money sitting there. So, the principle is that not everybody comes for their money on the same day. Well, sometimes when people get paranoid, they might do that, and that's where banks go under. Well, to prevent that and give people a little bit of peace of mind, FDIC will basically give you an insurance policy saying that, relax, if you put it in one of these institutions, you don't have to worry about it. So it's kind of a funny thing. I mean, if you look at like the history of banks, there was a bank, it was called the Bank of Italy, right? It was based in San Francisco. And this is back in the Depression, so before all of ours times, we're talking the 30s. What they did, the bank president or whatever, they got stacks of gold that they had in their vaults. And when there was a run on the bank, and all the banks were being run on, they had all these stacks of gold, obviously with guards and stuff, but they put it up in the front windows just to show that they had the cash reserves, and they actually had money and they were secure, and anyway, they were one of the banks that survived that whole turmoil because the customers um, were encouraged not to pull all their money out, and that way the bank still function. So that bank subsequently, when World War II came around, and Italy was one of the Axis powers on the wrong side, aligned with the Germans. Bank of Italy changed its name to Bank of America, and so that's how we have them. I'm not sure. Savings institutions. So they also, this is really, I'd never hear them referred to as thrift institutions, but that was a title that was once used as well. And then credit unions that you're familiar with. But to tell you the truth, most of you, rightly so, don't see a huge difference between a credit union and a bank. I'm sure there's some financial purists out there who, will talk about the nonprofit nature and the rest of all that stuff. But for you as the customer with your ATM card, do you really care? Probably not a whole lot. Used to have to be a member of, the certain group. You had to be like a teacher to go to the teachers one. I think that still exists to a certain extent, but if you walk into Alaska, USA, they're not, looking for you to be aligned with some company. And then non-depository things, financial institutions that don't have FDIC. So in this case, finance companies, those are things have gone horribly wrong in your financial life if you're going into one of these personal finance companies. It sounds almost like a bank, but believe me, they're not. The rates they charge are confiscatory, very high. Anyway, now when I'm talking about brokerage firms and things like that, um, a lot of times where I'd put my money there, in maybe if it's money that I'm just parking for a little while, I'd put it in government securities because it's almost the same as cash, and they're denominated in cash and they're backed by government securities. But if you look at the details, they are not FDIC insured. They don't have that $250,000 insurance. Now, things have really gone horribly wrong, and it's you're in survival mode if we get back to that point again. So I'm not that worried about that. But no, you don't have FDIC protection in most of those brokerage homes. Securities firms, so those are the ones I'm talking about there. And then insurance companies can do that stuff to a certain extent. They'll have a financial sector in amongst their insurance, and then investment companies, which again, we're splitting hairs here if we're trying to say investment companies and brokerage firms are different. But for the sake of the book, don't worry, this stuff we're not going to be asking for categories on the test. In fact, while we're speaking of the test, what's going to happen as we get closer to the test, the week before, I'll go through, I'll actually have the test in my hand, and I'll give you kind of a study guide of what to study for the test. So there won't be anything coming at you from, left field. So, when I say there's no formulas, per se on the test. When we talk about future value of money or list type things, that's not going to happen. We're going to concentrate on things that are relevant to your finances. So, and then financial conglomerates, which is kind of where we're at now. Just about everybody. I mean, literally, if you want to go into Alaska USA, and I don't know whether you can buy stocks through them, but I bet you that you can. But anyway, you can certainly get insurance, and you can do anything that you can do in a bank. And my brokerage that I use, they have a bill pay service. They have a credit card they offer. But I wouldn't want to have my daily bills paid through them because I like a bit of a firewall between my checking account that is got a lot of activity in it, but not a ton of money in it. A ton of money passes through it, but I don't keep a big chunk of cash in there that I would be concerned would be vulnerable to some sort of identity theft or something like that. I like the brokerage account to have very few transactions and fairly strict requirements in terms of telephone transfers and internet transfers to prevent bad things from happening. So again, these things, uh, whatever, it's a fairly steep curve where these services are becoming almost universal across all types of banks, checking accounts, write checks, um, paying bills on time. Well, certainly, yeah. And that's the beauty of like auto bill pay, just to keep that stuff out of your mailbox and make your life easier. Most any company now will insist upon, you not getting a physical paycheck, and by the same token, you can line up all your bills with your different monthly bills to have those deducted straight by the company or through your checking account. So you can avoid all these fees. Now, I'm not saying to pay early. In fact, like my mortgage company, if I set up auto bill pay with them, they deduct it on the first when the bill's not really done till the 15th. So to get around that, I set it up with the bank to send them a check on like the 9th, just because the principal. Um, Checking accounts. Yep, debit cards. Debit cards have made balancing checkbooks very, very difficult because or a lot of people are fairly methodical about balancing their checkbook. But when you start using a debit card, it makes it much more difficult. And debit cards, come directly out of your checking account. I used to be a big fan of debit cards, but some of the protections in terms of fraud and certainly the perks are not there. They don't generally pay miles. But the other problem is if there's a problem with some sort of bogus charges on your card, it's legally defined under credit cards. Under debit cards, it's a lot more of individual bank policy in terms of getting your money back. That if you call up and you say you got ripped off and you report it to Visa, the bank is going to say, "Oh yeah, we'll take care of that because we're such a great bank, and we're going to cover that. We're going to well, it's by law that they have to if you report it in a timely nature. They won't say they're being forced to do that. They'll say it's just out of the goodness of their heart. But with debit cards, it actually can be just out of their goodness and their policies, and so anyway, you don't want to be there, especially if you're reporting you were late to catch it. So online banking, yeah, we're all familiar with that. Monitoring your balance, so record your checks in your checkbook. I've had a few foreign students and, especially Europeans that are just perplexed by the whole nature of checkbooks. It's like, why do you guys do that? I mean, it just really doesn't happen in Europe. They have certain policies that are actually in certain ways better and sometimes worse. But for example, like credit cards in Europe or debit cards, or most cross, it's usually a chip and a pin. So this whole notion of signing, because you know those electronic signatures are more or less a joke. I mean, you can just put a line in and it accepts it. But in if you use a credit card in Europe, not a debit card, but a regular credit card, there's typically a PIN associated with it. And they also, at least in Germany, they always tended to use more cash. It was, it's kind of a sign of weakness if you paid by credit card, where I don't think there's that stigma in the U.S. But balancing a checking account, yeah. The big thing about a checking account and balancing is you need to have overdraft protection. It's not a if, it's a when type thing when you're going to have a check that's denied for insufficient funds, just because that's the nature of the way things work. And especially, you don't want to keep a huge surplus in your checking account, so you never ever bounce a check, because that's defeating the purpose. You don't want to keep that much money in your checking account. So anyway, you certainly need an overdraft protection. If you do happen to bounce a check, number one, that's a crime. I mean, so they kind of own you. They can charge you whatever fees they want, and you're stuck paying them. So you don't want to be in that situation. Usually it necessitates having a credit card with that institution, but so be it. You don't have to use the credit card. You just have to have it. And as long as it's a credit card with no annual fee, yeah, who cares? Just put it in a drawer, and what you really need is that overdraft protection. Check float, that's kind of an old concept, doesn't really work anymore. Most checks are processed electronically. Back in the day, I mean, I knew a lot of guys who built flight time by flying checks around, but now that they're all transferred electronically, it's not an issue. So people used to write, what they call a hot check, and they had 2 or 3 days before it was actually processed. That doesn't necessarily happen anymore. Credit card financing. So yeah, like I say, using a credit card for normal purchases, not cash advances, and paying off the balance every month is a great concept. Taking a cash advance is never a good idea on a credit card. I mean, unless it's truly emergency. They're going to charge you a fee right up front, and then they're going to start charging you interest from day one on that credit card. Squirrel. Um, the other thing that happens is, this is why I like to try and get my bills electronically. It's because I had a mailbox here in Alaska that was just constantly getting ripped off. Most of us, or not, a lot of us will have, mailboxes that aren't necessarily at our house. And we had, anyway, what they did was they got one of my statements, and they found those little checks that you get. They're not really checks at all. What they are is cash advance forms. And so somebody used one of those for like $300. And so, it wasn't me. And so I noticed it on the account within a day or two, and I contacted the company, and it was all taken care of. But I not only needed to get that $300 back, but they had also charged me like a $10 fee, and they were starting to charge me insurance on the rest of it. So, not insurance, but interest on the rest of it. So, just a second. Got to see what's going on with his pups. All right, moving on. So, safety deposit boxes, kind of a neat thing to have, but you have to pay a fee for them, and there just aren't that many. I mean, there's, how many people live in Alaska. There's not, in say Anchorage, 300 some odd thousand people. There's not nearly that many safety deposit boxes. Some people have them, but I think they're becoming rarer and rarer. Most people have a good fireproof gun safe that they tend to keep things in, and that's probably more useful. I mean, yeah, I do run into a student now and then that does have one, but it's not as prevalent as you would think. And then ATMs, we know about ATMs. Um, a lot of times too, when we're doing the homework assignment for this week, we'll deal with comparing banks, in your own situation, and you have to see, if you're, for example, using a debit card or an ATM card that charges you a fee if you're using it out of the network, you probably want to find a new bank. Um, I've always used an online bank out of Texas through the military, and they know that people are very sensitive to those fees, so they've always had a policy of reimbursing any fees 100% for ATMs. So if your bank's not doing that, you probably ought to find one who is. They also would pay me 15 cents every time I used a debit card. So, um, and it was a couple bucks every month when I used to use a debit card, but not so much anymore. But there's a lot of differences amongst banks in terms of the fees, and they know people are kind of creatures of habit, and they'll get associated with one bank and they'll just blindly keep it. And sometimes it's not in your best interest. Once in a while, you need to compare your bank against others to find out, make sure you're not getting ripped off. Cashier's checks. Cashier's checks are useful. What happens is this has to do with the float. Let's say you're buying, a piece of equipment or something from somebody off Craigslist or Alaska's List or something like that, and they may ask for a cashier's check. And what they're trying to prevent is that even though I talked about the principle of a float doesn't really exist anymore because there's electronic processing of the checks, but let's say you write somebody a check for 2,000 bucks. Um, until they actually go to the bank and cash it, they, may not, they don't know whether that 2,000 bucks is in the account. With a cashier's check, the bank will, when you go in there and buy a cashier's check, they'll either give it to you free or charge you a buck or two for it, but they will take those funds from your account and will allocate them against that cashier's check. And so the person who takes that check can be fairly confident that it's not going to bounce. But again, banks have individual policies. There's a bank up here that I basically, you know, closed out my account from because I walked into there with a cashier's check that somebody had written me, and they said, "Yeah, we need to put a hold on this for 3 or 5 days," and that's just a scam. That cashier's check represents no risk to them. It was actually drawn because the guy had an account with their bank, and they were just doing, whatever, screwing the customer a little bit. They also, I noticed, because I get some checks direct deposit. Um, my coworker would get his check a day before, and mine would show up, exactly on the first, whereas my coworker would get paid on the 29th or the 30th. So again, the bank was kind of playing and holding money, and this is a big deal to banks. I mean, if they do that to thousands of customers, where they can have their money on deposit, yet not make it available to the customer, they can make fractional interest or not have to pay any interest or do whatever and hold your money. So anyway, that's the things you notice when you're dealing with multiple banks, and maybe again another good reason to switch banks. Money orders. Money orders are largely for people who are what you would call unbanked, people who don't have access to cashier's checks. There's also some, funny institutions like every 10 years I have to get a money order because the passports are good for 10 years, and the State Department wants a money order. Hopefully by the time my passport expires this next time, they'll have gotten with the 90s and have moved on from money orders. But if you need a money order, you can go to a lot of different places, Walmart or whoever, and pay a buck or two and get a money order. Kind of goofy. not very prevalent as they used to be. Travelers checks, for me, I would never ever want to do this. These are kind of a relic as well. Travelers checks were a check that was supposed to be, where you go into some weird place and far off foreign country, and it was a means of paying for things. And this was before, credit cards and ATMs and, those types of things were worldwide. I was in, I don't know where it was. It was Eastern Europe somewhere, and the person was checking out of the hotel, and they had travelers checks, and the clerk had never ever seen one before, but was happy to accept my Visa card. So that's why I quit dealing with travelers checks altogether, because if as they become less used, your chance of being in some sort of necessity situation and having it refused is kind of common. Selecting a financial institution. So again, that's going to be covered in the homework assignment. But yeah, convenience, online bill paying, and most everybody does this. Um, yeah, Walmart, I guess, has got their own bank thing, but they really cater to the lower strata, the people that have no bank at all. Um, anyway, interest rates. One of the factors I'm really not that concerned with is the amount of interest that a bank is going to pay me on my money, because I don't keep that amount of money in there. A lot of times they'll have a minimum where you got to keep $1,000. And now I'm not saying that I necessarily let my checking account get much below 1,000, but if I let it drop below 1,000, they'll say you get no interest. Well, the interest that they're paying is so pitiful. It's so small that I'm not really all that worried about it, and I'm not going to jump through a bunch of hoops to try and ensure that I get it. The reason they pay such low interest is, well, because you typically don't have the money in there very long. Now, there's certain instruments like a certificate of deposit where you have to keep your money there for a year or 5 years or something like that. Then they'll pay you a slightly higher interest rate, but only slightly. And it's the reason why interest is paid. It's basically risk and return, right? And if it's in a CD, a certificate of deposit, your money's not really at risk, and so they're not going to pay you much in the way of interest, and so it's not going to keep up with inflation, and it's just going to be a problem. So anyway, risk premium. So there you go. Loan rates, sure. If the bank is paying you, say, 1%, the lowest that they're going to loan that money out, even then, subsidized rates is probably 5%, 3%, something like that. But that's only with things that have collateral. Typically, it's going to be much higher rate. And if you have poor credit, then it's going to be even higher. So when you see, for example, say a car dealership says we'll make loans to anybody, that's not where you want to go. You're not anybody. You should have a pretty decent credit score, and you want a very low rate. If they're making loans to anybody, then they're having to, um, you know, charge a higher rate to cover, basically the deadbeats. I had a friend, he used to loan money to a used car dealer, and this guy would pay him 20% on his money. He would give this guy like $10,000 chunks, and this guy would pay him 20%. So you can imagine the interest rate that he was charging the poor schlubs that came in there to buy used cars from him. Impact of the economy, again, some of this macro stuff that's out of our control. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but yeah, when the financial situation declines, interest rates will certainly change. Twist of perception. Yeah, double up to catch up sometimes, or but again, we're not going to go there. There's different types of investing, right? Investing means that there's a high probability of return. When you start getting into speculation, that's borderline gambling, which is not wrong, but that's not what you should be doing with with the bulk of your income, and certainly not money for retirement and things like that. Um, if you did things correctly, you paid yourself first, and you still have, say, $400 or something left at the end of the month to, you know, speculate on an individual stock is better than going to a, casino or betting on sports games or whatever. But anyway, comparing interest rates. So it has to do with risk tolerance. But what they're going to do here in this conversation is they're going to try to drive you to less risk is better, which is not necessarily the case. There comes a point in time where you kind of need to be comfortable with a certain amount of risk in order to have your money grow at a rate that's going to generate wealth for you. I mean, that's what's going to happen if you're in, most mutual funds. There's a certain level of risk that's acceptable, that will generate wealth for you. So, term structure of interest rates. So, typically, if we're talking U.S. Treasuries, I never invest in the long term with them just because the interest rates are so low. I move any sort of long term thing investment into generally corporate stocks. So I'm not so concerned with Treasury securities and their different maturities, but the longer you go out, say you go from a 6 month out to a 5 year, the 5 year typical will be paying a much more significant rate. But again, significant only compared to other U.S. Treasuries. Where to look at this? All sorts of things online. Wall Street Journal is not the only place, um, and there's entire websites, bankrate.com and other things that all they do is track loan rates and interest rates, and so it makes it quite easy to determine that with an interactive chart. The Federal Reserve, they tend to, or not tend, but they try to control the money supply. A lot of times they're out of sync, though. But what the theory being is that if more money is available, then interest rates will um, be reduced, and if the money supply is tightened, interest rates will go up. But it gets very political. But the ability of the Fed to change interest rates is suspect by many. They don't seem to have the control that they purport to have, and it's anyway a little controversial. But when you hear people talk about the Fed, they're talking about the Federal Reserve Board. So it's a pseudo government agency, um, and it's anyway, buying and selling, quantitative easing, things like that. That's all Fed actions. Now, the Fed will have especially during the previous administration, a huge effect on the stock market and other things because there wasn't a whole lot of true economic activity going on, and so they were more significant. Now that our economy is kind of rolling along on its own, the ability of the Fed to change things has been lessened, at least in my mind. Again, more opinion, not testable, but if you hear somebody talk about the Fed, that's what they're referring to as the Federal Reserve Board. So here's theoretically how they're supposed to do it. So they increase the money supply. They do that a lot of times by changing the interbank rate, the rates that one bank will loan to the other. And theoretically, firms are more willing to expand and then economic conditions improve. But it gets to a certain point where they keep pumping so much money in it just has a declining effect. So, all right. So back to the homework. What's most important to you, and what institution provides the best banking services? So again, all these different banks, credit unions, um, they're more and more providing all the same services. So it does come down to convenience and fees. I'm not so concerned about the interest rate. I probably am not going to get a mortgage through the bank. I'm definitely concerned about the fees, the locations, but if it's electronic, like I said, I've dealt with a bank in Texas for years and it was fairly seamless. Online is kind of the way to go. ATMs, if you're a big user of ATMs, do they insist that they be within the network? And if you are getting charged with fees, then how can you alleviate that? These are some of the interest rates that the banks are paying. So again, this is not, let's say I tie it up for 5 years in a certificate of deposit and I find one that's going to pay me 2.4%. Am I excited about that? No. Okay, number one, that's 2.4%. That's not a whole lot of money. Oh, by the way, that's taxed. So I'm not even going to get to keep all of that. And oh, by the way, I said inflation's pushing along at about 3%. So I'm not even treading water. I'm drowning here, and this is not good. These are inflation rates. So I said 3%, as a gross whatever, and I don't think I'm too far off, right? I mean, I could go back to I think it was 79. It was like at 18%. I mean, it's gone much higher, and sometimes we get in a recession or just a real slowdown here in 15. Right now, we've had fairly low inflation, but if I wanted to come up with a forecast of where normal inflation rates are, I think we'd agree it's probably about 3%. So now you do have other options than banks, and we're not talking about those in this chapter, but let me just show you. I mean, this is the Dow Jones, right? This is what you can be doing versus that 1% that's kind of flatlining. We're looking at about 10% per year in the Dow. And then if you get more extreme, now granted, if I could have bought more Shopify, I would have, but I own a fair amount of this, and I mean it's up a lot, 800%. Now that's over, you know, 3 years, but just the same, that's now it's going to fluctuate. I mean, Friday was a bad day. Um, People are concerned about coronavirus and all the rest of that, and stuff like that's going to happen. It's got a beta on here. We'll talk more about these types of details, but beta means the volatility as compared to the Standard and Poor's 500, which is kind of the benchmark. Well, it is the benchmark. It's how beta is defined. So if something is the Standard and Poor volatility is defined as 1, right? It's the definition of beta. So if something is beta 1.2, it's in this case 20% more volatile than the Standard and Poor's 500. So some of these numbers, I mean, they may not mean a whole lot to you. That obviously open, close, that's where it started, that's where it ended, that's the range it had. Volume 2 million. Um, last time, I don't care. Market cap, that's how big the company is, 54 billion. Shares outstanding, earnings per share, again, minus. That doesn't sound like a good number, but how's it up 800%? Because it's a, big growing company that people are forward looking. They're not necessarily concerned that much with their earnings. Almost 70% held by institutions, below high. Whoops. All right, moving on to the next chapter here. managing your money. So kind of the same thing, um, or more specifics. I mean, what we talked about in the last chapter was kind of the institutions, just to kind of review it. And this gets more into money management. I was discussing this a little bit, but that's basically how to take care of your short-term money in terms of, inflows and outflows like they're talking about. Liquidity is a big concept. I've mentioned this before, and liquidity is what you're looking for in terms of money management. This means that you don't have all your money, say, tied up in real estate or something that's illiquid. You have an account that you can pay your bills and move on. But again, um, you know, try and more money in liquid accounts is not necessarily a big, something you should shoot for. Some money in maybe an emergency fund, and then a credit card with a lot of balance available is a good thing. But to have 20 grand in your checking account is poor money management. So using credit cards, interest rates usually low. I don't care. I'm not paying it. Um, Maintaining adequate allows credit cards for paying bills. Yep. So you don't carry that balance. Um, Highest possible return on short-term investments. Yeah, I I don't keep them in there that long, so they're very short term. I'll switch things over to a brokerage account. I may still keep it in cash, but it's going to be in some sort of uh, government security thing where it's paying you know rates equivalent to those 5-year CD rates without being tied up for 5 years. And then I'm looking for opportunities to either put them in stocks or mutual funds. For most of you, just putting them directly into mutual funds is probably the best way to go. So checking account, as I said, super liquid. Overdraft protection is kind of a necessity. The fees are just stupid high, and you're not in a position to whine or complain about it because you screwed up, and so you just have to take it. And it's just not something you want to do. So make sure you got overdraft protection. Stop payments. Yeah, that's kind of a relic again. What you could do is, and I've had this happen once. Somebody paid me for some items, and when I'm selling things, I sell some horse related stuff, um, and so somebody was buying a bunch of corral panels, and they wrote me a check and whatever. I was unloading the truck, and I lost the check. And with the check, um, that could be a problem. But a week or so had gone by, I couldn't find it. So what I did was I called a customer and I said, look, I lost the check. Um, Please go to the bank and put a stop payment on that check and write me a new one, and I'll pay you the $5 or whatever it is that the bank charges to issue the stop payment. And so in this case, that actually works because since the check is lost, or even if it's found at this point, once a stop payment's put on that check can never be cashed. Now, if you legitimately buy something from somebody and then turn around and go put a stop payment on that check, yeah, you're a criminal. But that's not going to happen too often. Direct deposit, we're familiar with that. Fees, institution, no interest on most checking accounts, and again, the desirability of getting paid interest on a checking account is kind of silly because usually it has caveats associated with it, and usually it's not enough to worry about. Um, you know, Again, I think you're confusing whatever. It's not really an investment when they're paying rates that are sub inflation. So they had all these marketing things now, accounts, and, or even a savings account that I tend not to save money with the banks themselves. I tend to put it with a different company. So it not only does it create a barrier for identity theft, but it also creates a little bit more of psychological barrier. If I'm going to dip it in my savings now, I have to go to the brokerage company that's holding that kind of money. And I think it just keeps you from, you know, perhaps overspending. CDs, so just certificates of deposit, and typically with government securities. But again, not very attractive interest rates. So money markets, different type of money market. So again, they're going to switch these things around a little bit, and the names are, they're more tied to branding. So um, in fact, now accounts, you don't even hear that term very often. For a few years, they were offering, acting like it was, the next great thing, and I don't think they were ever that widely adopted. T bills, so just T as in Treasury, as in money from the U.S. government. Yep, money market funds. So commercial paper, banks can also have short-term debts, so short-term bonds. And at certain times, back in the day, there was a time where I was getting 8% on short-term bonds, but inflation was kind of out of control. But 8% from a bond was great. Now bonds aren't paying anywhere near that because inflation and interest rates aren't that high. So um, situations can change. They're looking at tabular data. Anymore, you should be going to graphs and looking at them online. Asset management accounts, again, marketing type things. Um, if you have a brokerage account, when you sell something, it will be deposited into some sort of asset management account, and pending your next trade. There's still some, even the stock market, where I talk about these financial institutions kind of playing you. They'll hold on to certain artifacts of the old days when it's advantageous to them. Like for example, if you sell a stock, it's not that money's not immediately available. There's a 2 or 3 day delay in there that's completely artificial. We're not waiting for you know horse and buggy type transportation. It was sold electronically. The funds should be there, but it's advantageous to the brokerage companies to be able to hold your money for a couple days and not make it available to you. So things will change, but it's one of the reasons things like Bitcoin and stuff like that have advantages because it's instantaneous and they don't have these artifacts and, old school things where they can hold on to your money. So when they say, you know, higher interest rates, relatively high, you've seen them. They're not exceeding a couple percent. So until they start, beating inflation. Now, I'm not saying you can put all your money in Shopify and figure that one out. I mean, that was based on some educated guesses, but I've had some losers in there as well. I mean, not you're never going to pick all winners, but any of these cash management secure type things, your money's not really at risk at all, and so the corresponding return is going to be quite low. Now, I'm not saying you have to go for a huge risk. There's ways to have a certain degree of risk, but you know, benefit from the stock market and earn, say, 10%, and that's what most investments in the stock market, if they're of any quality, you can earn 10% with minimal risk. Especially if you can handle some fluctuations, you'll make 10% over the long term. But you will have these fluctuations. You'll have days like Friday where you lose, a percent or two all in one day. But that's fine because you'll make it back if you have the time. If you're, somebody who needs this money next week, having it all in the stock market is not wise because if there is a downturn, then the fluctuation, you may not be there to enjoy it. So anyway, The what they're trying to show on this chart is that there is a corresponding connection between the degree of liquidity you have and typically the interest rate. So if there was a 5-year CD, it would have even a higher return. Checking account, there is no requirement, right? So if you're willing to give up some flexibility with your money, you can typically get a higher return, but not high enough to make it interesting. Risks of money market, yeah. Risk the borrower may not repay. Well, if it's the U.S. government, you got bigger problems than that. Interest rate risk, yep, that the interest rates could change. It could be more desirable investments, and then also the liquidity. I'm not a big fan of CNN. You've got other options out there. Actually, Yahoo Finance has got pretty good charting data. They're just passing on third party data, but just the same. All right, so you've got a lot of options here for financial planning online. Yahoo Finance is actually pretty good. I'm not a big fan of CNN stuff just because it's not as uh, concentrated on financial data. You've got all the news sites that have sprung up. All right, so yeah, I guess you could go to CNN, but there's Yahoo Finance. There's other sites that are even more specific. Any type of brokerage that you're associated with, it's going to have more personalized information, better charting. So you got a lot more options online than what the book uh, would lead you to believe. Um, Economic extensions, yeah. Again, you always have to be prepared. But the big deal is that given enough time, even the only people who lost, say, for example, in 2007, 2008, were people that defaulted, people who or pulled out of the market, got panicked. If you stayed in the market within the next year, you would be back up on your climb. To try and sell as the thing is declining, that's very difficult. That's called market timing. I mean, if you could pull it off, it would be financially very beneficial. But trying to decide when a falling market is hit bottom, they call that trying to catch a falling knife. It's quite dangerous. And then uh, trying to buy back in. I mean, you may do it at some point in your life. I've certainly tried it, but there's all sorts of advice that you know people far smarter than I have tried it and have been unsuccessful. Economic conditions again. Yeah, always consider the risk and return. May hold some commercial paper, but again, you know, risk is directly correlated to return. So you take no risk, you get no return, but you have that insidious inflation eating away at your money and you never build any wealth. So money market investments for me are strictly a liquid parking place. And I think that's true for most investors. They never expect to really make any money. They may think that the market's, at some all-time peak, or they're anticipating, a huge decline. But I tell you what, you could go to any financial paper right now and you could read about somebody talking about how stocks are absolutely going to fall and this is it, and there are all these doomsday guys, and they'll do that every single day for years on end. And then when it actually happens, they say, oh, it wasn't, you should have listened to me. Well, no, if I would have listened to you, I would have pulled my money out 3 years ago and missed out on everything. So, um, some of those people are not to be trusted. Interest rates have been low. Yep. Resist temptation to reduce these investments in favor of stocks. So, again, another person's opinion. You have to, jump into this on your own and read up and trust people. But also, especially these days, there's a lot of politics involved. So make sure that people are giving you unbiased advice and not tied to their politics. I mean, there are ways to make money on that too. I made some money on the last election based upon Tesla because I thought it was going to drop right after the election, which it did, and I'd shorted it, and it worked out. But that's sometimes when you realize that people offering advice are tied to a particular set of politics, and you can benefit from them. Um, yep. Again, kind of a self-briefing slide. So different options. Fidelity is one company that could do this. Also, Fidelity, and like I said, any of these mutual fund companies, but now they're even broader than just mutual funds. They've got all kinds of stuff, but they have things to help you with not only your financial strategy, but also your term um, paper. I'll talk a little about term papers. Here's Vanguard. Again, the website's going to be slightly different, but the things covered, um, they'll walk you through whatever it is you want. Calculators, tools. So would I go to CNN.com to get financial information? No. I would probably look at a quote here on one of these sites. So the term project, we're still semi-early in the term, but let's look at some of the details. Um, like I say, there's always a big question here. People read this first part about 5 years from now and they think it's an absolute. No, it depends on your financial situation. Depends on whether you're actually immersed in a career right now or whether you're, a traditional college student, or maybe you're a retired person just taking this class later in life. So there's still ways to write the paper, but its usefulness to you is based upon two things. Number one, that it's relevant in terms of when you're actually immersed in your career, so that you're dealing with the typical amounts of money you'll see when you're working, and then also that the hypothetical situation is pretty close to the situation that you forecast for yourself. So again, you don't put your actual numbers in there. You look at it, especially if it's 5 years out from now, you don't know exactly where you're going to be, but you sort of forecast for where you're going to be and you make assumptions based upon that. A lot of the things we'll talk about, one of the big hurdles for a lot of students these days is getting the student loans paid off. Um, and that may even affect your career choice. There's certain things you can do where there's a student loan forgiveness, and this isn't just politicians offering to pay those back for you. I think we're a ways off from that. But if that does happen, certainly you want to take advantage of it. But I would not bet on that. And um, number one, try not to get that far into debt. Number two, have a plan for paying this back. But the effect on the economy is pretty severe. There's a lot of folks right now that are out there in the in the workforce that are paying off their student loans, and they're delaying buying a house. They're delaying saving for retirement because they're trying to get these loans paid off. So it's going to have a huge impact. Social Security, go to the website, take a look at actually how much money we're talking about, and also, read up just on the solvency of the program. It will be funded, but it will likely be means tested, meaning that if you have any money at all, you may not get Social Security. That's just one plan, but something's got to be changed because they're not that well off. Life insurance, again, based upon needs, but also a little bit on opinions in terms of what you need. A lot of salesmanship involved in life insurance. It's easy to get, sold something maybe that you don't need. If you look at insurance for what it actually should do for you, it actually is a fairly straightforward proposition. But anyway, you'll define that in your paper. Um, how are you going to get ahead? What we talked about today, money market funds and things like that, that's not really what I would consider an investment portfolio because that's going to the purchasing value of that is going to decline over time based upon inflation. So you're going to have to do something, you know, be it real estate, be it a combination of real estate and the stock market, primarily through mutual funds, I would imagine. But anyway, come up with a plan on that. Does your company have a pension plan? You know, Probably not. It's probably on you, and it's probably a 401k. So if you're in the military, that's going to change things as well. It's going to put you in a situation where midlife you are going to have to grab a new career. So that's something to think about. Um, it should be 403b, 401k, 403b, thrift savings plan. Those are all sort of the same things. Tax deferred investments. 403bs are for nonprofits. Thrift savings is a military thing. 401ks are for most other companies. Um, but anyway, it can be useful, and that's the whole thing. In terms of flexibility, students will often send me something going, well, this doesn't really seem to fit with the format, but this is what I want to do, and usually they do a pretty good job of it. I'll mention this again later in the course, but I've had a number of students send me, sort of a draft copy, and I'll send it back to them saying, yeah, if you submit it as is, you'll get a B right now. If you add a few things to it, specifics, you can get an A. So, the grade you get on this thing it doesn't have to be that much of a shock at the end. You can, start working on it now and and come up with something that you can use. So, in terms of the homework, so this is what I was alluding to. You're going to select 3 banks. So again, this is not an assignment. You're not going to find this in the book. Um, but look at some, banks, credit unions, whatever, and one would probably be your own. One may be an online, one may be whatever, but look at the fees and the policies for these, different banks. And some things are, I mean, like I say, like when they delay direct deposit, that's kind of annoying. I've had other banks, I've had especially with some of the local banks where I'll want to do something that's very straightforward and it becomes kind of an ordeal with them or becomes expensive. But it depends on your situation too. I mean, there's certain banks I was having to do overseas wire transfers, which probably none of you will ever have to do, but the rates on that vary from about $10 up to $100 per transaction, and the average was about $50. So it makes a huge difference. There's things out there now called, like one company I use now is called TransferWise that does it what the banks used to do for $100, they do for $12. You'll see also, if you have to do a wire transfer, just a domestic one. Again, some of you may never do that, but some banks make it a arduous, expensive process. One bank demanded that I had to come into their branch to do the domestic transfer where I've done those things online with a bank in Texas for a number of years, and they claim, oh no, there's a legal requirement. I'm like, well, it's not that hard to come in, but don't tell me there's a legal requirement because I know there's not. I've done it many times, and anyway, it's just you'll see these little uh, peculiarities of a bank that impact upon their convenience that you may want to look at. And then for just about everybody, uh, ATM fees and just monthly fees, those are kind of a no-brainer that you need to check. And then the convenience factor. If it's right next to you, and even the bank is right there or in the grocery store you use, and they're a buck or two more a month, maybe that's worth it. So just be able to justify it, and it's just about a couple paragraphs up to a page that you're looking for to put your observations on. All right, and that's it. See you next week.